Hey folks, welcome to Black Gumbo. Let's talk about crop rotation. Is it necessary for gardeners to practice crop rotation? If you've been into gardening for any amount of time or read any traditional gardening books, you've heard about crop rotation and the need to crop rotate, that if you don't crop rotate, you're going to cause disaster to befall your garden and you're going to be sorry. But really, is it really necessary? What is crop rotation? Crop rotation is when you move your different kinds of plant families from one place to another season by season so that you don't have the same kind of plant families growing in the same soil year after year. For example, I have 3 raised beds in my garden. And if I'm going to grow tomatoes in one bed and cucumbers in the next bed and say broccoli in the next bed, those are 3 different plant families. And crop rotation says that the best practice would be the next time I grow, I should move my tomatoes into the next bed, move my cucumbers into the next bed, and then take my broccoli and bring it back to the first bed. And so you rotate your crops through your soil so that you're not growing the same crop in the soil each year. Why? Why is that an issue, and why do they say we should practice crop rotation? Let me tell you a little bit about what crop rotation is supposed to do for us, how it can benefit us, and why people advocate for it. The first reason we're told that we have to rotate our crops is to preserve the soil fertility. The idea is that if you plant the same thing in the same place year after year after year, you're going to deplete the soil. That's true, and that's why you have to artificially fertilize that soil if you're doing a big monocrop. But is it necessary in our little gardens? We'll see. The second reason they tell us that we have to rotate our crops is because there's soil-borne diseases that we need to avoid. That if you plant the same thing over and over and over in the same spot, all those diseases are going to build up. Spores, early blight, things like that, powdery mildew. Is it really that big of a deal? In our small little context, I don't think it is. The third thing we have to avoid, they tell us when we rotate crops, is pests. That if you plant the same crop in the same place every year, year after year after year, you're going to build up all kinds of pests. For example, nematodes. You're going to have nematode problems. You're going to have different grubs and beetles in the soil, overwintering in the soil. All these concerns are valid concerns, especially if you're monocropping on a large scale and you're not really amending your soils. If you have healthy soil, you're going to have balanced soil. You're going to have a balanced ecosystem. Look at the forest. Look at a prairie. Look at some place where things grow naturally. They grow year after year. The same stuff reseeds itself year after year. But what you have there is a healthy ecosystem of many different kinds of organisms breaking down into the soil and adding diversity to the soil. And so that's part of the key, is a well-balanced, healthy garden bed with good soil in it. And you can avoid some of these problems. So do you have to rotate? I think there's some principles we can practice in our garden that are wise, but I don't think we have to be so uptight about rotating our crops through our garden. It has to do with a principle called the fallow ground principle. At least that's what I'm calling it. I'll explain that for you. My uncles in Rosenberg, Texas, for many, many generations farmed the traditional way. They farmed cotton, they farmed rice, they farmed sorghum, and they ran cattle. And they grew on 80 to 100 to 200 acres at a time, and they would grow these monocrops where you've just got fields and fields of sorghum, fields and fields of cotton, and they would have to add chemical fertilizers to the soils just to be able to give nutrition to these plants. And the next year they would follow that crop with a different crop, and it was necessary for them at that time. And every 4th year, I think every 4th year, at least periodically, they would come through and let that land go fallow. And they would run cattle on the land, and it would grow weeds and grasses, and all the native stuff would grow up. And fallow ground helps to rebuild the health of the soil. And on large-scale farming, that's very important. In fact, it goes way back to ancient times. Even in the Bible, the law of God talks about giving your 7th year crops a rest, and let your ground go fallow. And that was wisdom, because your ground needs to restore itself. If you're putting the same crops on over 80 acres, then yes, you might have to practice crop rotation, because the soil is being depleted on a massive scale. And year after year after year, if you're putting the same kinds of crops in, you're not replicating nature at all. In fact, monocropping and large-scale farming doesn't replicate what you find perhaps in a forest. If you go look at a forest, Or if you go look at some natural prairie area, or you go look at any natural area that has been left alone for years and years, what do you find? You find the same stuff growing there year after year. You find a big diversity of plant life. You find those plants growing up, dying, rotting into the soil, composting, and feeding the next generation. But there's a diversity of plant life there. There are hundreds of species of weeds and shrubs and trees and bushes and all kinds of plant life there, all growing together in a polycrop, is what it, or a polyculture is what it's called. And so you've got all this diversity of life, and there's a balance there, because the plants that are using up, a whole lot of nitrogen are being fed by plants that drop a lot of nitrogen into the ground. And that's the same way with all the different nutrients. There's a diversity of nutrition in the natural soil. So, amending your soil with compost replicates the fallow ground principle. And that's the key to crop rotation or not crop rotation in a small garden. In the farm environment, in the big monocropping environment, if you plant the same thing in the same place year after year and you're not amending the soil with a biodiverse compost, or you're not letting your fields go fallow frequently to replenish all the nutrients in the soil, then yeah, you're going to have trouble. Your plants are going to suffer and your soil is going to become just clay. Your soil is going to be bad. But in a garden like this, we can replicate fallow ground by adding compost to our soil, and we can amend our soil with all that rich nutrition that mimics the fallow ground principle, and we can do it every single year. And so we can grow the same thing over and over and over fairly safely in our small gardens, because we have control of the soil, we have control of what we put in it, and we can add to our soil that which monocropping takes out, and we can do it artificially. It's a natural process, but we're doing it elsewhere and importing it into our garden in the form of compost. So, do you have to rotate your crops in a small garden? Not if you're composting and adding that material back into your soil on a regular basis. This is my fallow ground compost. What I'm doing is I'm taking all kinds of stuff and putting it in my compost pile, letting it rot down and turn into humus, rich, organic, nutrient-rich humus. And so all this organic matter is very diverse. It's weeds, it's kitchen scraps, it's all the stuff you throw in your compost pile, cardboard boxes, things that I'm not growing in my garden. And so this is a very wildly diverse bit of nutrition. And when I add this to my garden, it's the same as if I had let my garden lie fallow for several seasons, because I'm getting all kinds of nutrition and I'm putting it back in the soil. And so the key to healthy gardening that doesn't require you to rotate your crops is to have good soil health. Good soil health. So look at this soil. This is my corn, and I've also got some beans coming up. That one's been attacked by something that likes to eat the leaves. But I put a 1 or 2 inch layer of compost on this bed when I transitioned from tomatoes to corn. And the reason I did that was to add nutrition to my soil. And so it's all up here on top. It's working its way down into the soil. And you can see the soil is very, very loose. I'm bringing in fungal life. I'm bringing in different kinds of plant matter that have decayed down, different kinds of food matter that have decayed down. That's why we don't have to worry about it too much, because what I'm doing is I'm replacing in the soil whatever the plants take out, and I'm replacing it with a great surplus of nutrition. I mean, there's more nutrition here than all these plants are going to need. So the fallow ground principle is what allows us to garden in our backyards without crop rotation. And we are taking the fallow ground principle and we're artificially practicing it by composting. So compost takes into our garden beds all of that nutrition, all of that biodiversity, all the mass from the compost pile and everything we put into it that's so diverse. It puts that into our gardens and acts like a fallow year or two. Because all of the stuff that's going into the soil in a fallow year, we're putting it into our soil as compost. So we're short-circuiting that process. We don't have to practice that. And because we're doing that, we are amending the soil with all the nutrients our plants need, so we don't really have to concern ourselves with rotation that much. Now, there actually is a good reason to rotate your crops through your garden that doesn't really have anything to do with all those 3 reasons that they usually suggest crop rotation. And that is, in a no-till garden or a minimal till garden like I practice, it's nice to have different crops come through and treat the soil. The different crops actually affect the soil in different ways. For example, you know, a root crop's going to come in and is going to displace a lot of soil as those roots grow, and it's going to till up the soil in a different way. It's going to churn the soil, move the soil, and leave root channels behind in a different way, and I'll be pulling those roots out, and that aerates the soil. As opposed to something like these cucumbers here. These cucumber plants are relatively shallow rooted, but they spread their roots far and wide, and when I come in and I put a new crop in, I don't till the soil, and I don't pull up all those roots. I leave those roots behind, and those roots just, thanks Phoebe for bumping my tripod there. Yeah, you're crazy, aren't you? You're crazy, huh? Good girl. Gardening with corgis. All those roots that I leave behind are going to decay. They're going to break down in that soil, and as they break down, they're actually root channels left behind that the earthworms use, that the next crop will use to place its roots through there easily. Aerates the soil, it breaks up the soil, and keeps the soil loamy. And so if I plant different kinds of crops in different areas, the roots and the effect on that soil is frequently very much different than the previous crop, and that's beneficial, and it helps keep the soil aerated and helps the tilth of the soil. So that's a really good reason why these cucumbers will come out this year, and next year I'll plant my cucumbers somewhere else in the garden and not necessarily right here. But I wouldn't be afraid to plant them here if I had to. So there you go. There's a little bit about crop rotation and why it's really not that critical if you're a small gardener. It's a good practice to work into your system if you have the ability to, or if it works out, if it's convenient for you. It's not going to hurt you. Surely it's not going to hurt you. But you don't have to worry about it, and you don't have to get all tied up in knots about, well, my crop rotation isn't going to work out this year, so I can't grow tomatoes. Now grow your tomatoes. Amend your soil, add compost, add diversity of life. Healthy soil equals healthy plants. Like us on Facebook, Instagram, and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. And we'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.